Final Fantasy X was the first game in the series that I ever played, and it's been a long-time favorite of mine. I felt it fitting that I review it for the first video in my tier list, so join me on my journey through Spira. Final Fantasy X takes place in the world of Spira, and follows the pilgrimage of Summoner Yuna, who is on a quest to defeat Sin. Along the way, you'll uncover secrets about Yevon, the predominant religion of Spira, and encounter enemies both monstrous and human, forging unlikely friendships and making enemies of unlikely organizations. There's twists and turns at every corner as you unravel the corruption of Spira and seek to end its cycle.
You would have to send me too.
Sin is supposedly the punishment for the inhabitants of Spira who went too far in their grandeur, seeking power that ultimately had corrupted them. The story is told through the eyes of Tidus, someone who knows as little about Spira as you, the player, do. That's because he's from Zanarkand, a city destroyed 1,000 years ago. This lack of a link to Spira gives the game plenty of opportunities to explain what's happening to you in organic ways, and the ways the characters interact both during the story and in battle serves to strengthen their bonds with one another and form relationships that are unique from character to character. Wakka, famed for hating Al Bhed, has a rocky relationship with Rikku, an Al Bhed party member, that he works through. Lulu serves as a mentor to Tidus, teaching him about history and traditions, and Yuna and Kimahri have a very protective bond, more intense than her bond with any of the other party members. Tidus is seen as a warm and joyful presence that causes many to gravitate to him for one reason or another, including Yuna, who uses him as her own personal source of hope throughout the story. These characters are a high point of the story. Each brings a unique perspective about Sin and summoners themselves to the table that clashes and fleshes out the narrative, along with Seymour, who is a man hell-bent on becoming Yuna's final Aeon, and eventually Sin itself. Seymour provides the story with a much-needed humanoid antagonist at the forefront, as the threat of Sin serves more as a background antagonist. These dynamics and characters help to reinforce the plot and give you many viewpoints to understand, and in my opinion, all of them except maybe Kimahri are fantastic characters full of detail and purpose. It's these personal narratives that I think are the highlight of the story because Final Fantasy X as a game is about people. Not a specific event or an organization, but people in general, their reactions to sin, their suffering, and the cycle of death that Spira is trapped in. There are some problems with the story though. The most glaring of these is the pacing, which at times feels overtly slow. Other times, specifically for a good portion of the middle of the game, it feels like a plot shotgun with a barrel of ammo, with the most climactic part of the game featuring all of the twists happening at least 10 to 15 hours before the actual end of the game. This can be jarring, and it goes on long enough that it can become exhausting going from reveal to reveal with a sudden lull in the story before that pace builds back up again, but it's not too big of an issue. Gameplay in Final Fantasy X takes place in two main ways: on the fields, where you can shop, talk to NPCs, and explore different maps, and in combat, where you perform, well, combat. Many NPCs will give you items along the road, doing what they can to help their summoner. And then there are puzzles like the Cloister of Trials, none of which are too complicated, but serve as a lull in the gameplay that can get boring, especially if you've already solved them before. Where I believe this game truly shines is in the combat. Final Fantasy X uses a system brand new to the series, a turn-based system in which your actions influence turn order. This means that using an item might be faster than attacking, and some actions take even longer than normal attacks. Some spells and abilities also influence the turn order, and you can see all of your expected outcomes before you use an attack. This system adds a layer of strategy to different battles, where delaying enemy turns and maximizing your own are crucial to victory. Each character has a predetermined role in a team, with Tidus being the quick hitter who gets turns faster, and Wakka having higher accuracy to deal with flying enemies. There is some class crossover in this game to solve a serious problem that plagues RPGs, which is usually class bloat. So while Tidus is a quick hitter, he's also your time mage, sporting an array of other supportive tools, and while Yuna is your white mage, she's also obviously the summoner. Each character takes aspects from a handful of classes with the exception of Lulu, who is just a black mage, and the result is most classes have a lot of varied utility. This is a good thing too, as battles take place in only a party of 3, with each character able to swap at any time. This forms the foundation of the battle system, and it's famously well liked, making it commonly reused and reimagined both in less commercial fan projects as well as in many other JRPG series today. The most prevalent of series that currently does this is the Trails of series, whose battle system isn't identical but shares many similarities. One issue I have with this though is what it does to enemy designs. You see, everyone is always available, and having clearly designed roles isn't a bad thing. In fact, I praise the system for how it designed its classes in the first place.
But there's a caveat here. Enemy design is hurt by it really bad.
You'll often find the same types of enemies everywhere you go, and the necessity for everyone to participate in battle in order to even earn experience means that you'll find yourself swapping to characters that you don't even need to use just so that they get experience. Not to mention seeing multiple similar designs of a fast enemy that outspeeds everyone but Tidus and Riku, or a flyer that is hard to hit without Wakka, or a flan that only Lulu can damage well, gets boring after a while. At least as the game progresses, they add Machina for Riku to deal with and hard-shelled enemies that Auron can easily kill. But again, these aren't really anything Lulu or a character with piercing on their weapon couldn't handle, and they get kind of boring.
I'll give them credit though. There's multiple variants of this role type that you will have to fight off.
Lulu has the flans and elementals, Wakka deals with small birds and evil eyes, and Auron gets larger lizards. These differences serve to spice things up throughout the battles, and numerous enemies aren't designed with the rock, paper, scissors style in mind anyways. Most of the time these are just medium-sized enemies or enemies that are weak to magic. Not all designs are samey, but having 1 to 2 encounters on each table be a rock, paper, scissors fight, and then most of the others being 1 or 2 of those enemies but with 1 supporter gets boring, especially while grinding. Boss fights are a whole different beast though, with many of them having a gimmick to them that you have to play around. Some are as simple as an enemy who absorbs magic until its tentacles are killed, or as complex as fighting against Seymour, in which attacking discs behind his back changes his elemental affinity. Which I don't have footage for, but here's a screenshot. This helps make bosses feel unique in more ways than one compared to normal encounters. Each boss is a puzzle that you have to decide whether or not to solve or brute force to victory. I'm gonna be honest though, most of the time I tried to solve the puzzle and ended up brute forcing it before I could even solve the puzzle because they're just not that difficult. This is in no small part because Yuna's Aeons are brutally efficient. Aeons can be summoned to the field with a full overdrive meter, on top of one given to them from Yuna's own overdrive, letting them do obscene damage. Because of this, many of the endgame bosses have summon instant kills to prevent you from relying on this too much, but summons clean up most of the early game with ease, as do basically every character's overdrives just used, with Riku's mix having more utility than every other character in the game. This isn't necessarily a negative. I found my first playthrough was plenty challenging as it was, but it's worth noting how easy the game can be until it gets its dramatic difficulty spike with the final couple bosses. Regardless of its flaws, however, I think Final Fantasy X's combat is incredibly satisfying when you get used to it. Planning out your turns to maximize damage and minimize taking it can be extremely enjoyable, especially in the later parts of the game. Final Fantasy X rewards you for all that grinding in a few ways, but there are 2 very important ways, specifically spheres and experience. Think of spheres like a resource for gaining power, and experience as the medium through which your potential is measured. Every time you gain a level, it's not actually a level, but one circle of movement on the sphere grid, a non-linear board that every character shares and they start on different positions and so on. Navigating the sphere grid can be rough. Despite being a little rough, it does provide the player with an interactive form of growth and eventual decision making. There's multiple different types of nodes on the sphere grid that correspond to different stats. These nodes give you different stats and abilities depending on the node, meaning rather than gaining real levels, you build your stats over time and gain abilities the deeper into the grid you move. This isn't a bad concept, and most of the other games have built upon it in some way, such as Final Fantasy XII and XIII with their license board and Crystarium. They're both somewhat similar in concept, but much more ironed out. There are also key nodes, which can be unlocked with key spheres, which are somewhat rarer and ultimately pretty plentiful resources that allow characters to leave their own linear path and explore another character's path, or closed off areas that might have better stat increases. This helps with the linear feel of the sphere grid without actually making it go away, but the real problem with the sphere grid is something someone on a casual playthrough is just never going to experience, and that is that the openness of the grid presents you with a problem that other titles like Final Fantasy VI have. Every character can get every node, spell, ability, and so on. Which of course means that in the end, there's only a few things that actually matter for differentiating your characters. Even after breaking the damage limit, there's a second hard limit you eventually reach, and once you reach that limit, only characters with multi-hit overdrives can increase their damage any further. This unfortunately leads to some characters being less valuable strictly on a numbers basis. This is a problem later entries into the series alleviated through more limitations, like in the Zodiac Age remaster of Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy X has something like this as well, the Expert Grid. The Expert Grid is more open and allows you more control over the path your characters take, but it doesn't completely solve the issue. It is fun to play with though. Other methods of progression are Aeon customization, which you get about 30 to 40% of your way into the game, and weapon customization, which is gained shortly after. These both allow you to give your weapons and Aeons new abilities and beneficial stats. These are welcome additions that just take a little too long to really come online. You need to steal copious amounts of items to make it happen, and eventually even use a skill called Bribe, which makes you spend tons of money to get items from creatures. Overall progression in Final Fantasy X is fun, but sometimes a little frustrating. Most of the pain points of the Sphere Grid aren't very impactful though, and optimizing your party and weapons is fun to play around with. There are some production issues that the game has, mostly due to it being many firsts for the series. It's the first voiced mainline Final Fantasy game, and the voice cast is fantastic, but the voice direction leaves a lot to be desired.
They say Seymour went to Macarena Temple.
Macalania Temple.
Alright.
Beyond just that, facial expressions are mediocre at best. I assume it's in part due to hardware limitations, though the 3D has come a long way since the first series title to include it, which was Final Fantasy VII. That's not to say that these things impact my rating. They are issues, but most of the time I found myself laughing at them rather than being frustrated with them. And I don't think how well a game is aged matters as much as long as it's still fun and enticing. This is my favorite game in the series, despite many of these issues that I do have with it. These issues don't really have anything to do with how fun the game actually is. They definitely detract from the experience, and they often do remind you that you are playing a video game, but at the end of the day, you still enjoy the time you spend with it. To kick off this series, I'm putting Final Fantasy X in A tier. I love this game, and while objectively it's not the best in the series, I think it can stand amongst the best in the series. Let me know if you disagree, and I will see you for the next game. Also, it's the best in the series.